Okay, pick up where we left off last time in the colonial period. One of the fascinating aspects about this particular part of the world is that even though the Chinese government was never all that interested, in fact, many times shut down their entire coastal border, there was a huge problem with pirates. You're going to watch it, go into an interesting series of Google online travels, go and look at the huge pirate fleets that you had in this part of the world right into the 1800s. Well, they were a huge problem. In many cases, had up to like a couple of hundred ships involved compared to like Pirates of the Caribbean stuff. So anyway, so the Chinese government frequently, almost in this last 2,000 years, has been really uninterested in anything that's wet in the sense of oceans or the South China Sea. Having said that, Chinese, especially coastal Chinese, especially from Fujian and Guangdong provinces, were heavily involved in fishing, offshore trade. And so what you got was basically, even though the governments never really supported it, and they really didn't see the place as part of their territory, which is is sort of ironic given the 9-9 line now. There were lots of Chinese sort of wandering around this part of the world. And so what you had was basically, rather than government running stuff, what you had was trade running stuff, which is sort of interesting because when you think about it, that's eventually what happens with the Dutch and then the British era with their commercial operations that basically drag the governments into the colonization of this part of the world. And so what happens is the Chinese by the 11, 12, 1300s had set up sort of trade towns, if you want to think of them that way, scattered all the way from basically, this from Hainan here in South China. Manila had a large Chinese community by the 1300s. And again, down all the coast of Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, even into the eastern coast of parts of India. So basically anywhere you sailed along the coast in what we now consider Southeast Asia, if you went along sooner or later, probably sooner, you would bump into a Chinese community. Now, the thing about this that's really interesting is one is almost all of them come from Fujian Guangdong province. In other words, they come from this little area here. So they're not from China proper. Many of them, because Guangdong province is more famous, traditionally was called Canton. So Cantonese speakers, which is what you have in Hong Kong, are from Guangdong. So that particular ethnic group has a very distinctive dialect, and Fujian province has its own dialect also. And so what happened is by 500, 600, 700 years ago, you had large actually towns scattered all up and down throughout Southeast Asia that consisted entirely of Chinese, but they weren't Chinese from Han, ethnic majority China. They were ethnic minority Chinese, largely from Southeast, part here, Cantonese. And so it wasn't part of a government operation. It was just people out to make some money. And, since the distances were large, it made more sense if you're going to set up a store, someone had to stay in the store, and you had to have a warehouse. And so pretty soon what happened is parts of the family would move down there in your warehouse and in Ho Chi Minh City, it used to be Saigon, would eventually have houses around it. People would stay, and pretty soon you got a compound, bang, pretty soon you got a town. All this had no government supervision nor government protection. Having said that, since people still had their networks with their relatives and compatriots and whatever in China, these essentially were sort of like outposts of Chinese civilization, even though they weren't political outposts. And for the area here, since, as I mentioned last time, you don't really have any sort of centralized, largest sort of state system for most of this region for most of this time. And so what happens is the Chinese basically become the middlemen for a lot of stuff. So throughout all of Southeast Asia, in fact, even still today, you find a lot of the banking is actually done by Chinese. A lot of the wholesale or merchandising or moving stuff from one place to another is done by Chinese, not ethnic Malay, not ethnic Vietnamese, not ethnic Indonesians, but by Chinese. And the key part of this is, again, if you go back to when I was talking about China earlier in the semester, is that Chinese were very welcoming in the sense of other folks that wanted to be Chinese, but Chinese weren't interested in being other people. So what you find is with the Chinese, especially in Southeast Asia, is they never assimilate. The Chinese communities throughout this region, many of them are 300, 400, 500 years old. The people in there still are Chinese. They still speak Cantonese. They would still, in many cases, actually find brides or spouses up in Hong Kong or someplace like that and have them sent down, or Guangzhou, have them sent down. You always intermarried in the Chinese community. They were bilingual, so they could speak, Malay or Vietnamese or whatever the language that was there, but they never actually became Malay or Vietnamese. They stayed very specifically Chinese. Their architecture, their dress, everything remained Chinese in this country. So they were intentionally foreigners, not so much because the locals wanted them to be foreigners, but because the Chinese wanted to stay foreigners. As far as they were concerned, even if they'd been there for 300 years, they were still Chinese living in Cambodia or Chinese living in Vietnam. They were not Vietnamese. So it wasn't like, moving to the United States and becoming, quote, American, unquote. There's no sense of assimilation here. And, not surprisingly, if you're Malay or if you're Vietnamese or something like that, this really grates on you because it sort of implies, one, that you're not interesting enough for them to want to be a part of you. They're not going to intermarry with your population. But on top of that, they control most of the financial sector. They control most of the business sector. So these buggers are getting rich. They're getting rich. They have a huge amount of power, and they don't want to share, and they don't want to be like you. And given the fact that you outnumber them by, 1,000 or 10,000 to 1 or something like that, not surprisingly, a lot of irritation and sort of pissed off attitude from the locals tends to spill over into these relations. Now, this might have been sort of a temporary phenomenon, but then Europeans come in. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, everyone come into this region. And when they do, since they're already interacting with the Chinese over here, and they and the Chinese sort of they know how Chinese work, basically. And since they're involved in trade also, it makes perfectly good sense if you're the Dutch or if you're the British or the French or whoever, that, if you're the French over here, you're going to go and you're going to see these Chinese communities and you're going to think, well, hell, they're already the ones that control the money. So I can do the banking with them. We can trade, whatever, cash reserves or whatever that is. They're the ones that already do all the wholesaling. So if I want to trade with stuff from here up to north, or if I want to trade with stuff to France, then I'm going to deal with the Chinese. So when the Europeans come in, the Chinese become the interface, if you would, between the European colonization and the local population that's doing the work. So the Chinese become the middlemen. And that means they become even more wealthy. They become tied and visually become part of the colonial empires, the British, the French. In the Philippines, for example, the Spanish, the Chinese become very close with the Spanish because they're in charge. When the Americans take over in 1898, the Chinese are like first up to bat saying, hey, welcome. So these communities of Chinese throughout all of Southeast Asia not only remain Chinese, but even when the Europeans come in, if anything, it becomes more exaggerated. So the Chinese become the go-to people. If you're the British and you want to deal with the local, the Malays, for example, in Malay, what British called Malaysia, you get the Chinese to do a lot of that for you. So the Chinese, become the tax collectors. The Chinese become the census takers. The Chinese become basically sort of the middle level of government, for all the different European groups all throughout this region. And not surprisingly, this tends to generate even more heat from the locals, who see themselves, in many cases, rightly so, as aced out of having any way to make anything out of this colonial empire that now been stuck with. And the Chinese are sort of like, well, tough. So this sort of persists. Now, of course, post-World War II, when this region starts to get independence, so for example, the Vietnamese, basically, initially formed two Vietnams. Cambodians, sort of define their country. Indonesians define their country, and then probably most importantly, Malays take over after a pretty brutal short civil war. The British leave, and then the Malays take over Malaysia. One of the first things throughout much of Southeast Asia that happens is you do sort of an ethnic cleansing, you might say. But what you do is you get rid of the Chinese. So in much of this area, when independence happens, and your ethnic groups that are part of that particular region get their ability for sovereignty, the first group they have on the list, other than the Europeans who they want out, but even more importantly, the first group they have on the list, like we want you out of here, like last week, are the Chinese, the ethnic Chinese. So what you get is massive, refugee situations, on the diaspora level of ethnic Chinese who in many cases might have lived in Vietnam for 300 or 400 years. But on the other hand, they never became part of the culture. They never became Vietnamese. They were very, in some ways, pretty arrogant about the fact that they were Chinese, and therefore, in their view, they were better. And so when the Vietnamese get control of the place, they're like, hey, dude, you had your chance, go back wherever home might be. This is most spectacularly seen in two locations. In the 1940s, when Malaysia gets independence, the ethnic Chinese all up and down here, there are a large number of Chinese settlements. What they do is they're trying to figure out what to do. It's pretty clear when the Malays are talking about independence, even as they're starting to make this movement, that the Chinese are not welcome. So your Chinese communities all around here, who of course are wealthy, they're identified by Chinese and they still speak Chinese, they still dress and act Chinese, are looking around going like, holy crap, we're outnumbered 10,000 to 1, so we gotta get our butts out of here. But going back to China really isn't an option, and going, where else are you gonna go? So what you get in this part of the world, this includes Indonesia, Malaysia, to a certain extent Thailand, is the British had what they called a crown colony. So it was like Hong Kong, it was a separate entity from Malaysia, and that was Singapore. Singapore was basically, if you look at it here, it's basically an island. It's actually a cluster of islands. And the British, because it controls basically the one easy way to get from the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean, which is right through the strait here, is the British very early on put a fort here and made this into a settlement. There was a small fishing village there, but not really the locals were doing much with it. So the British set up shop there and make it into a seaport. And very quickly it becomes the centerpiece of the British East India Company along with Hong Kong. And so what happens is port grows, really rapidly as British trade throughout this area in the late 1700s, early 1800s picks up. Singapore picks up along with it. By the late 19th century, the late 1800s, Singapore is one of the major and probably one of the richest colonial possessions the British possess in the world. So they keep it separate from Malaysia. And they actually very closely manage Singapore. They put a huge naval base there about the same size as Pearl Harbor to run basically the British Navy in this part of the world. And so, it becomes the centerpiece, if you would, of the British colonial empire in Asia is Singapore, even more so than Hong Kong. So Singapore becomes center of all this. Now, when Malaysia's talking about independence, of course, the ethnic Malays are thinking, well, that includes Singapore. In the period that the British controlled the place from the, roughly say 1800 on, what had happened is it got a huge percentage of the population was ethnic Chinese. They either moved to Singapore from Hong Kong or other places because it was a good place to make money. By the 20th century and when the various upheavals are occurring in areas like Malaysia and Indonesia, other ethnic Chinese who are already living in this part of the world migrate to Singapore because they see it as being more politically stable and safer, and it's under direct British control. And so what happens is Singapore more and more, even though it's literally part of Malaysia, it's just an island off the south coast, pull apart. So when Malaysia declares its independence, initially Singapore says, well, okay, we'll be part of be one of the states in the country of Malaysia. But the Malays pretty much tell them, well, that's not really going to happen, but we want you to be part of Malaysia because you basically, there's more revenue and more money coming in and out of Singapore every day than there probably was every month in the entire country of Malaysia. Singapore looks at this, and also the fact that Malaysia is starting these anti-Chinese things. And a lot of the Chinese here, literally refugees screaming down the coast to get here to safety in Singapore. And the folks in Singapore say, no, we're not going to be part of Malaysia. And so what they do is they declare themselves an independent state. It's one of the smallest countries in the world. And literally here, you can see the blue line here. It's literally nothing more than this island and a little bit of offshore islands. All these other islands actually belong to Indonesia. So Singapore is an incredibly small place. Malaysia, initially, there's a huge amount of bad blood, and there's actually some fighting that goes on as Malaysia tries to force Singapore to be a part of it. And of course, the British by then have left. But Singapore holds its own and basically declares its independence. Singapore is now 1, 2, or 3 in one of the wealthiest places in the world because roughly something between 40 to 45% of the entire world traffic that goes on ships goes through Singapore, and most of it stops in Singapore, and most of it is containers that are loaded or reloaded in Singapore. So Singapore has become the center of the container, travel of goods and resources, basically from all of Asia, where most stuff is produced. To places west, Europe, East Coast of the United States, etc., all goes through this little gap here. Now, in the last 20 years, the relationships between Singapore and Malaysia have got a little bit better, but it's still sort of a fascinating example. Singapore is still, this large proportion of the population is ethnic Chinese. You go there and you still hear people, a lot of the folks speaking Cantonese, for example. So they are still, even in the 21st century, a lot of this place still has its vibe. It's still a combination of the British colonial period and also these ethnic Chinese that used, in many cases, The families that are now in Singapore used to be scattered over, who knows how many thousands of miles in Southeast Asia, left and moved it here. And what that also meant is they moved their networks, their social resources, banking. Singapore has one of the largest banking industries in the world. And that's in part why, because these guys already had that. And a lot of these countries that wanted the Chinese out have probably, in hindsight, are probably thinking, oh, that wasn't a particularly good idea. Now, the second time this happened is when North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam, and it goes back to being a unified country. A lot of the ethnic Chinese had moved into the South Vietnam Republic when North Vietnam was formed because the Vietnamese were very explicit. They didn't want the Chinese around. And so what happens is when Vietnam is unified, when the North Vietnamese finally take over the southern part of the country, what happens in the 1970s, again, huge refugee movement of ethnic Chinese from especially what used to be called Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, where there was a huge portion of the population was ethnic Chinese, as in the rest of this region. These people are basically not allowed to stay. They're going to be put into re-education concentration camps. And so what happens is they just have to, in a panic, they have to get up and become refugees and leave. This becomes the infamous boat people movement of the 1970s and right into the 1980s of largely ethnic Chinese trying to escape Vietnam to go anywhere. In some cases Singapore, but also might be Manila, might be wherever. This is a huge influence here in Hawaii because a lot of the boat people, they get picked up by American vessels, end up here in Hawaii eventually. Not necessarily, it's the first place of residence, but they end up in here eventually. And so if you go to a lot of the Thai and Vietnamese and other restaurants here on Oahu, you'll find if you actually, know the people and talk to them, you'll find in many cases the original family actually were Chinese ethnic refugees from Vietnam. One of the ironies is here is because we already had a large Chinese population. If you were, ethnic Chinese, but from Southeast Asia, it was really hard to make a living here because, Chinese restaurants, all that type of stuff that turf was already taken. So it's largely this group that basically sort of invents the idea of Vietnamese food here in Hawaii. And also to a certain extent Laotian, a couple of Cambodian restaurants. I know Burmese is getting popular. And that's all, and many of those folks are actually, basically ethnic Chinese from those areas. But, they lived in Vietnam for maybe 300 years. They knew how to cook Vietnamese food and probably ate it at home occasionally. So, being ethnic Chinese didn't mean you couldn't do Vietnamese stuff. But it's sort of interesting here in Hawaii, and it's also true in much of the West Coast of the United States, that it's actually ethnic Chinese that we, in the United States, and even to a certain extent here in Hawaii, see as Vietnamese versus folks who are actually ethnic Vietnamese. So it's one of the sort of paradoxes of refugees and identity. But the key part about this is a sort of fascinating aspect that the Chinese never give up their identity of Chinese, even after hundreds of years in these other parts of the world. And right now, what you've got, as of 2022, is the country city of Singapore, which is based almost entirely on this ethnic Chinese relationship with the huge majority populations around them.